Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into a topic that's super relevant, I think, for all of us trying to understand, the world around us, nationalism.
Yeah.
And especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC, particularly that international relations paper, this is one you really don't want to miss. We're going to be dissecting some excerpts from a text that goes really deep into nationalism and how it impacts global politics.
Yeah, it's something that's often misunderstood, oversimplified, or even dismissed as like irrelevant, in
Yeah.
this world that's, increasingly globalized. But the truth is, nationalism is still this really powerful force shaping everything, from domestic policies to international conflicts.
Absolutely. So to kind of kick things off, let's just address the elephant in the room. What exactly is a nation? Is it just a group of people living in the same place, or is there more to it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We use terms like nation, state, country, even race sometimes, as if they're all the same thing, but there are some really important differences, especially for those of you tackling international relations, like the United Nations. It's an organization of states, not nations.
That's a really good point. It's easy to get those terms mixed up, but understanding the difference is key to unpacking the whole idea of nationalism.
For sure. And to make things even more interesting, a nation isn't just about those objective factors like, shared language, religion, history. It also has this really powerful subjective element, a sense of belonging, a shared identity, and even shared aspirations.
So it's not just about being from a place, but feeling connected to that place and the people who share that identity. Like, think about the Quebecois in Canada. Their nationalism is rooted in their French language and culture, which makes them distinct from the rest of Canada, which is predominantly English-speaking, even though they share a country. That linguistic and cultural difference really fuels a strong sense of Quebecois nationalism.
Exactly. And that's why we call a nation this psychopolitical entity. It's about how people feel as much as it is about any of those objective markers.
It's this fascinating mix of tangible realities and perceptions. It's amazing how this abstract idea of a nation can have such a powerful force in the world.
And speaking of how this idea came about, wasn't there a debate about the origins of nationalism?
There is, you've got two main camps, the primordialists and the modernists. Primordialists believe that nations have really ancient roots, that they're kind of these organic entities that evolved naturally over time, from shared ancestry, territory, and language.
So for them, it's like nations are almost an extension of family, and that sense of belonging to a nation is really embedded in human nature.
Exactly. Think of Johann Herder and his idea of the Volksgeist, the unique spirit of a people. He believed this spirit was rooted in their language, their culture, shared history, making each nation unique and valuable.
Okay, so that's the primordialist view. But how do modernists explain the rise of nations if they're these ancient eternal entities? It seems like a totally different way of thinking. Yeah. Modernists argue that nationalism is a much more recent thing, tied to those massive social and political shifts that came with modernization, particularly during the Industrial Revolution. They believe that in many ways, nations were constructed by states.
So instead of ancient roots, modernists see nations as almost invented or imagined to meet the needs of these modern societies.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big difference from the primordialist view.
It is. Think about Ernest Gellner, a leading modernist thinker. He argued that industrialist societies needed a new kind of social glue to replace those traditional bonds that were kind of breaking down. Nationalism, with its focus on shared language, culture, and identity, fit the bill perfectly.
So in a way, he's saying that nationalism was almost invented out of necessity to hold these new large-scale societies together. It's like the glue that binds individuals to this larger group when those traditional ties aren't there anymore.
Exactly. And then there's Benedict Anderson, who coined the term imagined community to describe nations.
Oh yeah, the imagined community. I remember this from my UPSC prep. It's an idea that stuck with me. What's so powerful is that
It highlights that a nation is imagined because its members can never actually meet everyone who shares that identity. It's created through those shared experiences, symbols, media, and education. Things like national anthems, flags, even shared stories about a nation's past.
it's like this collective imagination that creates this really strong sense of belonging, even though it's based on a shared idea rather than direct personal connection.
Exactly. And that leads us to a really important question. How does this imagined community turn into real-world power? How does nationalism shape global politics?
That's what we'll be tackling in the next part of our deep dive. So make sure to come back for part two, where we'll explore how this potent force of nationalism has shaped history and how it continues to influence international relations today. And for all you UPSC aspirants out there, this is where things get really relevant to your exams. We'll be connecting the dots between those theoretical frameworks and real-world events.
We'll be examining how nationalism has been a driving force behind wars, revolutions, the rise and fall of empires, and the creation of new states. We'll also look at its impact on diplomacy, international organizations, and the global balance of power.
So yeah, things are about to get really interesting. Buckle up, folks. And in the meantime, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss part 2 of this deep dive into nationalism. See you there. Welcome back to our deep dive into nationalism. Last time we really laid the groundwork, exploring what a nation actually is and all those theories about how it came to be.
Right, because it's one thing and to understand like the concept of a nation, but it's a whole other thing to see how this abstract idea like turns into actions and shapes global politics. And for those of you studying for the UPSC, this connection to real-world events that's super important. Definitely. Let's just start by recognizing, the huge impact nationalism has had on shaping global order. Wars, revolutions, empires rising and falling. Nationalism has been a key player in a lot of these big moments throughout history. Just think about the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires after World War I.
Yeah, wow. The dismantling of those empires led to so many new nation-states, each driven by their own sense of, national identity and self-determination. It was a crazy time of upheaval fueled by nationalist aspirations.
Exactly. And those events still have consequences today. For example, the legacy of those empires, along with, how the borders were redrawn in the Balkans, it all contributed to the ethnic tensions that eventually led to the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. It's like a stark reminder that the forces of nationalism can have a long and complex ripple effect on the world stage.
It's almost like a chain reaction, where events in one period set the stage for conflicts or political changes decades or even centuries later. It's a lot to unpack. But for UPSC aspirants, understanding these historical connections is key to analyzing what's happening in international relations today.
Absolutely. But let's not just dwell on the past. We're living in an era defined by globalization, interconnected economies, more migration, instant communication across borders. So the question is, can nationalism survive or even thrive in this world that's getting more and more globalized?
That's a really interesting question. On the surface, it seems like globalization and nationalism would be like totally opposed to each other. Globalization is all about, breaking down barriers, while nationalism often emphasizes those distinct national identities and interests.
Right, and for a while, a lot of people thought that globalization would slowly erode national identities, leading to this more, homogenous and interconnected world. But as we've seen in recent years, nationalism is not going anywhere.
Actually, it seems like it's making a comeback in a lot of parts of the world. We see it in the rise of populist leaders, the push for stricter immigration policies, and even those ethno-nationalist movements that are popping up again.
Exactly. And this resurgence of nationalism is, in a lot of ways, a direct response to globalization. For some people, globalization has brought economic anxiety, a feeling that their jobs and their way of life are being threatened by global competition or immigration. For others, it's led to this cultural anxiety, a fear that their traditions and values are being eroded by outside influences.
So it's like nationalism becomes this defense mechanism, a way of holding on to your identity and protecting what you see as valuable when faced with these perceived threats from globalization.
Right.
It's a way of saying, hey, we're different and we want to hold on to our way of life.
Exactly. And this is where things get even more complex because nationalism, as we talked about before, it's not just one thing. It comes in a lot of different flavors, each with its own implications for world politics.
Yeah, right. We talked about civic nationalism, where people are united by shared values and a commitment to democratic principles. This type of nationalism can be really powerful for building inclusive societies that are stable.
And then you have ethnic nationalism, which is based on a shared ancestry or ethnicity. This kind of nationalism can be more exclusionary, often leading to tensions and conflicts, especially in places with a lot of different ethnic groups.
Like the rise of those ethno-nationalist movements in Europe, they often promote this really narrow view of national identity that excludes minorities and immigrants. And that leads to social divisions and political instability. And understanding these dynamics is super important for anyone analyzing current events, especially for those of you getting ready for the UPSC exams.
For sure. And then you've got religious nationalism, where religion is tied up with national identity. This can be a really powerful force mobilizing people around their shared religious beliefs. But it can also lead to conflict within and between states.
Like in the Middle East, where religious nationalism has played a big role in shaping politics and fueling regional conflicts. It's a really complex and sensitive issue. But you can't ignore it if you want to understand how international relations work in that region.
Right. And that's why understanding these different types of nationalism and how they play out with globalization is so important. It's about seeing the nuances, how these forces can bring people together but also divide them, and how they impact everything from international trade to diplomacy to security policies.
So it's not enough to just know the definitions.
Yeah.
You have to see how these ideas play out in the real world, how they influence the decisions leaders make and the actions that countries take. It's about connecting the theory to what's actually happening, which is a key skill for anyone who wants to work in diplomacy or international relations.
Exactly. And as we move into the last part of our deep dive, we're going to look at some specific examples of how nationalism is shaping global politics right now, from the rise of right-wing populism to the challenges facing international organizations. So stay tuned for part 3, where we'll dive even deeper into these real-world implications of nationalism.
And in the meantime, why don't you think about how nationalism is showing up in your own country or region? What forms does it take? What impact is it having on politics at home and on international relations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been on quite a journey exploring this world of nationalism, from trying to define what a nation actually is to understanding all those theories about how it came to be. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, and we've seen how this idea, that seems so abstract, has had this huge impact on history wars, revolutions, empires rising and falling. It's been eye-opening for sure, especially seeing how nationalism is still such a powerful force, even with globalization. But let's kind of bring it all together. What are the key takeaways from all this? What should our listeners, especially those UPSC folks getting ready for the international relations paper, really remember about nationalism?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that nationalism isn't just one thing. It comes in so many different forms. You have the inclusive kind of civic nationalism we see in some democracies, and then you have those more exclusionary types, like ethnic or religious nationalism, which can lead to tension and conflict.
Right, and recognizing those subtle differences is really important when you're looking at what's happening in the world.
Right.
It's not enough to just know the definition. You need to be able to spot the specific type of nationalism and understand what it might lead to.
Exactly. And for those studying for the UPSC, that ability to analyze and see the differences is crucial. You might be asked to compare and contrast different nationalist movements. Think about how they affect international relations, or how they interact with things like globalization or regionalism.
Yeah. It's all about making those connections, seeing how these concepts we've talked about play out in the real world of global politics. And speaking of globalization, that's another big takeaway, right? We saw how globalization and nationalism, even though they seem contradictory, are actually totally intertwined.
For sure. Globalization has, in a way, fueled this resurgence of nationalism we're seeing. For some, it's brought economic worries and fears about losing their culture. For others, it's made them realize how important it is to protect their national identity in a world that's becoming more and more connected.
So it's not a simple case of globalization making nationalism disappear. Instead, it's this complex back and forth that's really shaping the geopolitical landscape.
And this dynamic is playing out in different ways around the world. We see it in the rise of those populist leaders who appeal to nationalist feelings, often by using people's fears and anxieties about things like immigration or the global economy.
Like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Narendra Modi in India. They've really tapped into that nationalist sentiment to gain power and change their country's policies, both domestically and internationally.
And more broadly, this resurgence of nationalism is creating challenges for the current global order. You see it in the skepticism towards international institutions, the rise of protectionist economic policies, and even in the return of competition between major powers.
Think about Brexit. It was a clear example of nationalism in action, driven partly by a desire to take back control of national sovereignty and immigration, and it's had this ripple effect on European politics and the EU's place in the world.
Exactly. And for those of you studying international relations, these are the kinds of real-world examples you should be thinking about. How is nationalism affecting diplomacy, trade, security alliances, the balance of power? These questions will help you connect the dots between theory and what's actually happening out there.
So as we wrap up our deep dives, I think the biggest thing to remember is that nationalism is here to stay. It's a powerful force that's going to keep shaping the 21st century. And understanding how complex it is essential for anyone who wants to make sense of global politics, whether you're studying for the UPSC, working in policy, or just a citizen trying to understand the world around you.
Totally. It's about recognizing the nuances, appreciating the different kinds of nationalism out there, and understanding how it all works with other global trends. And most importantly, it's about seeing the power of ideas and identities in shaping the world we live in.
It's been a great journey, and we hope you found it insightful. We've just scratched the surface, of course, but hopefully this gives you a good foundation to explore further.
And for those prepping for the UPSC, remember that knowledge is key. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep making those connections. The world of international relations is always changing, and staying informed is the best way to succeed.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And before we go, we'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on nationalism in the 21st century? What examples have you seen? And what do you think it means for the future? Share your ideas in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going.
We always appreciate your thoughts and feedback. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking explorations of the forces shaping our world. Until next time, keep diving deep.